In the summer of 480 BC, a small force of Greek warriors stood at a narrow coastal pass, watching the horizon darken with the dust of the largest army the world had ever seen. They knew they were going to die. They knew their names would echo through eternity. But what they didn't know, what none of them could have imagined, was that their sacrifice would change the course of human civilization forever. This is not the story Hollywood told you. This is not a tale of 300 immortal heroes. This is the real story of Thermopylae, and it's far more remarkable than any myth. The Persian Empire in 480 BC was the superpower of the ancient world, stretching from the shores of the Mediterranean to the edges of India. King Xerxes I, grandson of Cyrus the Great, commanded resources that made other kingdoms look like villages. His father, Darius, had tried to conquer Greece a decade earlier and failed at Marathon. That defeat haunted the Persian royal family like an open wound. Xerxes would not make his father's mistakes. He would not send a mere expeditionary force. He would bring the entire might of Persia to bear. And he would crush the Greeks so thoroughly that no one would ever dare resist Persian rule again. For 4 years, Xerxes prepared. Across the vast empire, from Egypt to Babylon, from Phoenicia to the steppes of Central Asia, the call went out. Every subject nation, every conquered people, every vassal king was required to send troops. The Persians built a bridge of boats across the Hellespont, the narrow strait separating Asia from Europe. When a storm destroyed it, Xerxes ordered the sea whipped with chains as punishment. He had the engineers executed and new ones brought in to build it again. This was not a man who accepted failure. Ancient historians give wildly varying numbers for Xerxes' invasion force. Herodotus, writing just a generation after the battle, claimed the army numbered over 2 million men. Modern historians dismiss this as impossible. Feeding and moving such a force would have been beyond the logistical capabilities of any ancient civilization. But even the most conservative estimates are staggering. The realistic figure sits somewhere between 150,000 and 300,000 fighting men, supported by an enormous fleet of perhaps 600 to 1,200 warships. By any measure, this was the largest military force assembled in the ancient world up to that point. In the spring of 480 BC, this massive army began to move. Imagine the sight. Column after column of soldiers stretching beyond the horizon, taking days to pass any single point. Persians in their scaled armor and distinctive fish-scale caps. Medes in their leather and felt. Bactrians with their powerful composite bows. Immortals, the elite 10,000 who formed Xerxes' personal guard, so named because their number was always kept at exactly 10,000. If one fell, another immediately took his place. Indian contingents with their cotton armor. Ethiopians in lion and leopard skins. Libyans, Egyptians, Phoenicians, and dozens of other peoples, speaking dozens of languages, worshipping dozens of gods, all marching west under the banner of the great king. One Persian soldier later described the experience. "We marched for weeks. The column stretched so far that you couldn't see where it began or ended. When we camped, our tents covered the valleys like a second earth. Rivers ran dry after we drank from them. We believed we were invincible. How could we not? Nothing in the world could stand against such power." Greece in 480 BC was not a unified nation. It was a patchwork of independent city-states, constantly feuding, often at war with each other. Athens and Sparta were the two great powers, but they were as different as fire and water. Athens was a democracy, a radical new experiment in government where citizens voted on laws and policy. It was a place of merchants and sailors, of philosophers and artists, a city always looking forward, always changing. Sparta was the opposite. It was a military oligarchy, a society built entirely around war. Spartan boys were taken from their mothers at age 7 and raised in brutal military training camps. Weakness was culled, strength was worshipped. Spartan men lived in barracks until they were 30, eating together, training together, fighting together. They were the most feared warriors in Greece, perhaps in the entire world. When news of the Persian invasion reached Greece, panic spread. Many city-states immediately surrendered, offering earth and water to Xerxes as tokens of submission. Who could blame them? What chance did scattered Greek cities have against the might of Persia? But Athens and Sparta refused to bow. They sent messengers to every Greek city-state, calling for unity, calling for resistance. Most refused. Some claimed neutrality. Some actively sided with Persia, hoping to be on the winning side. In the end, only 31 city-states out of over 700 agreed to resist the invasion. The Greeks who chose to fight formed the Hellenic League, with Sparta taking command of the combined forces. They faced an impossible strategic situation. The Persian army could march through northern Greece essentially unopposed. The massive Persian fleet could sail down the coast, landing troops behind any defensive line. How do you stop an invasion when you're outnumbered 10-1, or worse? When the enemy controls both land and sea? When half your potential allies have already surrendered? The answer lay in geography. Greece is a land of mountains and narrow passes. The Persians might have superior numbers, but they couldn't bring that superiority to bear if they could only advance through bottlenecks. The Greek commanders identified two critical choke points: Thermopylae on land and Artemisium at sea. Thermopylae, the Hot Gates, was a narrow coastal pass between the mountains and the sea, barely wide enough for a single cart in places. If the Greeks could hold this pass, they could block the Persian advance. Meanwhile, the Greek fleet would engage the Persians at Artemisium, preventing them from simply sailing around the defenders. But holding Thermopylae required soldiers willing to face almost certain death. It required men who would stand against impossible odds, knowing that reinforcements might never come, knowing that they were buying time with their lives. It required Spartans. King Leonidas of Sparta was 60 years old in 480 BC, an ancient age for a warrior. He had 2 sons, but neither was old enough to inherit. By Spartan law, only a king who died in battle could have his name inscribed on his gravestone. Perhaps Leonidas knew this would be his monument. Perhaps he understood that sometimes a king's greatest duty is not to win, but to show his people what it means to refuse surrender. When the Spartan assembly debated sending forces to Thermopylae, religious festivals limited how many could go. The Olympics were approaching, and Spartan law forbade military campaigns during sacred truces. Leonidas was authorized to take only his personal bodyguard, 300 men, all of whom had living sons to carry on their names. One Spartan mother, giving her son his shield as he left for Thermopylae, spoke the most famous words in Spartan culture: "Come back with it, or on it. Return victorious with your shield, or return dead, carried on your shield. Never throw your shield away in flight. Never abandon your post. Death before dishonor." This wasn't empty rhetoric. This was the code they lived by, the code they would die by. But the story that 300 Spartans fought alone at Thermopylae is a myth. Leonidas commanded a much larger force. 700 Thespians, citizen soldiers from the city of Thespia, volunteers who chose to stay until the end. 400 Thebans, whose loyalty was suspect since Thebes was leaning toward Persia. The Spartans had also brought their helots, the slave population who served as light infantry. Perhaps 900 helots marched with the 300 Spartans. On the first days of the battle, before the final stand, the Greek force numbered about 7,000, including contingents from various city-states. But when the end came, when the position became untenable and other Greeks withdrew, when the final stand was made, the forces that remained numbered around 1,500 to 2,000 men. The 300 Spartans, the 700 Thespians, the 400 Thebans, and the Helot light infantry. We forget the Thespians. History remembers Sparta, but the Thespians made the same choice, the same sacrifice, and nobody tells their story anymore. One Thespian soldier named Dithyrambus wrote in a letter that was later found, "The Spartans have their code and their fame. We have only our choice. We could leave. We could survive. But if we run now, how can we ever look at ourselves again? How can we teach our sons about courage if we don't show them what it means?" The Greeks arrived at Thermopylae in mid-August. The pass was even narrower than they'd hoped. At its tightest point, the gap between mountain and sea was only about 15 meters wide. An ancient Phocian wall, crumbling but still standing, gave them a ready-made defensive position. They rebuilt and reinforced it. This would be their killing ground. The Spartans positioned themselves at the center, the place of greatest honor and greatest danger. Other Greek contingents protected the flanks and provided support. For several days, nothing happened. The Greek scouts reported the Persian army approaching, but Xerxes made no move to attack. He was waiting. Surely these Greeks would see reason. Surely, when they saw the vast Persian host stretching across the landscape, covering the earth like a carpet of men, they would surrender. Surely no one could be foolish enough to actually fight. Xerxes sent a scout to observe the Greek position. The scout reported something bizarre. The Spartans were outside the wall, exercising and combing their long hair. They seemed utterly unconcerned, as if they were preparing for a festival rather than a battle. Xerxes summoned Demaratus, an exiled Spartan king who now advised the Persians. "What are they doing?" Xerxes asked. Demaratus explained, "They are preparing to die. It is Spartan custom to groom their hair before battle, especially when they expect that battle to be their last." Xerxes reportedly laughed. He still didn't believe it. He gave the Greeks 4 days to withdraw. They didn't move. On the 5th day, Xerxes' patience ended. He sent forward his Medes and Scythians. Good quality troops, but not his best. He was still hoping the Greeks would break without requiring him to commit his elite forces. It would be a simple matter. These were barely 7,000 defenders. He had hundreds of thousands. Surely they would scatter after the first charge. They didn't scatter. The first Persian attack crashed against the Greek phalanx like a wave against a cliff. The phalanx was the Greek method of warfare, and the Spartans had perfected it to an art form. Soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder, shields overlapping, spears projecting forward. Each man protected himself and the man to his left. The formation moved as one, fought as one, breathed as one. Individual prowess mattered less than collective discipline. The Spartans had trained for this their entire lives. They had fought in phalanx since they were children. They could maintain formation over rough ground, while advancing, while retreating, in their sleep. The Persians fought differently. They relied on individual skill, on waves of attackers overwhelming the enemy through sheer numbers. They wore lighter armor than the Greeks, carried smaller shields, fought with shorter spears. In an open-field battle, their mobility and numbers would be decisive. But at Thermopylae, there was no room for mobility. The pass forced them to attack on a narrow front. They couldn't bring their numbers to bear. They couldn't flank. They could only come forward into the teeth of the Greek spears. A Spartan warrior named Dionysius left us one of history's most defiant quotes. When told that the Persian arrows were so numerous they would block out the sun, Dionysius smiled and said, "Good, then we'll fight in the shade." That's not bravado. That's a man who has accepted death and found freedom in that acceptance. Fear comes from worrying about survival. Dionysius wasn't worried about survival. None of them were. The Medes attacked in waves. They pushed forward, crowding into the narrow pass, and died. The Greek spears, nearly 3 meters long, outreached the Persian weapons. Greeks stabbed from behind their shield wall, safe and steady, while Persians pushed forward over the bodies of their comrades, trying desperately to reach the enemy. When Greek spears broke, the Spartans drew their short swords, the xiphos, and continued fighting. When shields were damaged, men picked up shields from the fallen. When the front rank was wounded, they fell back and fresh men took their place. The rotation was smooth, practiced, efficient. This was their craft, and they were masters. The Persians fought bravely. We shouldn't diminish their courage. They advanced knowing they were marching into a meat grinder. They attacked again and again, trying to find a weakness, trying to break through. But the phalanx held. Bodies piled up at the wall. Blood made the ground slippery. The afternoon heat was tremendous. Both sides were exhausted. The Medes finally pulled back, having achieved nothing except horrific casualties. Xerxes was furious. He sent in fresh troops. Same result. The pass was too narrow. The Greek position was too strong. He committed the Immortals, his elite 10,000, the best soldiers in the Persian army. Surely they would break through. The Immortals were veterans, professional soldiers, equipped with the finest weapons and armor. They advanced with discipline and skill. The Greeks met them with the same unyielding wall of bronze and iron. The Immortals bled like everyone else. The fighting on that first day lasted from morning until dusk. The Persians achieved nothing. They lost thousands of men. The Greeks had light casualties. When night fell and the attack ceased, the Greek position was as strong as it had been at dawn. The Persian commanders were in shock. This wasn't supposed to be possible. Numbers were supposed to matter. They had sent tens of thousands of men into that pass. All they had to show for it was a field of corpses and a defensive line that hadn't budged. One Persian officer wrote, "We thought they would break after the first charge. We thought they would run after the second. We thought surely the Immortals would shatter them. But they didn't break. They didn't run. They didn't even seem afraid. I've fought across this empire. I've seen brave men. These Greeks were different. They fought like they wanted to die, but they were too good at killing to die easily." The second day was worse for the Persians. Xerxes tried different tactics. He sent his men in smaller groups, thinking that specialized units might succeed where mass attacks had failed. Nothing worked. He tried to tempt the Greeks out of their position by feigning retreat. The Greeks weren't fooled. They held the wall. The Spartans even developed a tactical innovation during the battle. They would pretend to retreat in disorder, drawing the Persians forward. When the enemy broke formation in pursuit, the Spartans would wheel around in perfect order and cut them down. It was a move that required extraordinary discipline and timing. Only soldiers of their caliber could pull it off. The heat was relentless. Both armies were suffering from the conditions, but the Greeks had water sources behind their position. The Persians had to bring water forward. The Greeks could rotate men off the line to rest. The Persians had to keep fresh troops marching forward because their front ranks were being slaughtered. The Greek position was sustainable. The Persian attacks were not. By the end of the second day, Persian morale was cracking. The soldiers were starting to ask questions. How long would this last? How many more would die in that cursed pass? Some of the subject contingents, troops from conquered nations fighting for Persia because they had no choice, began to wonder if they were on the wrong side. If Greeks could fight like this, if they could hold against such odds, maybe Persia wasn't invincible after all. But Xerxes had one advantage the Greeks couldn't counter: intelligence. In any military campaign, local knowledge is invaluable. Someone always knows the hidden paths, the secret routes. At Thermopylae, that someone was a Greek named Ephialtes. History remembers him as the greatest traitor in Greek civilization. His name became synonymous with betrayal. But what drove him to betray his people? Some sources say Ephialtes was motivated by greed. Xerxes had promised rewards to anyone who could show him a way around the Greek position. The reward was substantial, enough to make a man wealthy for life. Other sources suggest Ephialtes was a local shepherd who had been rejected by the Greek forces, perhaps because of a deformity or disability. Maybe he sought revenge against men who had dismissed him. Or maybe he was simply a realist who saw the inevitable Persian victory and chose to be on the winning side. We don't know his true motivation. We only know what he did. Ephialtes came to Xerxes on the evening of the second day and revealed the existence of the Annihilation path, a mountain trail that wound through the hills above Thermopylae. A force could march along this path and emerge behind the Greek position. They would be surrounded, trapped between the main Persian army at the pass and the flanking force from the mountain. The position that had been impregnable would become a death trap. Xerxes immediately dispatched the Immortals under the command of Hydarnes, one of his best generals. They set out at dusk, marching through the night along the Annihilation path. The trail was narrow and treacherous, but passable. The Greeks had posted a guard force on the path, 1,000 Phocian soldiers who were supposed to prevent exactly this kind of flanking maneuver. But the Phocians were caught off guard. When they heard the Immortals approaching, they withdrew to a nearby hilltop, preparing to defend themselves. The Immortals ignored them. Their mission wasn't to fight the Phocians, it was to get behind the main Greek force. They marched past the hilltop and continued along the trail. A Phocian runner made it down the mountain to warn Leonidas. Dawn was breaking. The Spartan king realized immediately that the position was lost. Some accounts say Greek deserters had also warned him. Other sources mention scouts who spotted the Persian movement. However the information reached him, Leonidas understood the situation. The Persians would emerge behind them within hours. They would be surrounded. There was no retreat route that could get 7,000 men away before the trap closed. Leonidas called a council of war. The debate that followed would determine who lived and who died. Some argued the entire force should attempt to withdraw immediately. Others pointed out that a retreat under pressure, with an enemy force about to hit them from behind, would turn into a massacre. The slow-moving phalanx would be cut down from behind by the mobile Persian cavalry and light troops. Leonidas made his decision. Most of the Greek force would withdraw immediately while they still could. The Spartans would stay and hold the pass, buying time for the others to escape. This is where we need to be clear about what happened, because the myths have obscured the reality. Leonidas didn't order the other Greeks to leave. He released them from their obligation. He gave them permission to survive. Most took it. The Peloponnesians withdrew. The Locrians withdrew. The Corinthians and Mycenaeans marched away. Nobody calls them cowards. They had fought bravely for 2 days. They had bought time. Their cities needed them to fight again another day. Leonidas released them, and they went. But the Thespians refused to leave. Their commander, Demophilus, made it clear they had come to fight, and they would stay until the end. 700 men from a small city, choosing death over retreat. The Thebans also remained, though ancient sources question whether they stayed voluntarily or were held by the Spartans as hostages to ensure Theban loyalty. Given Thebes' later collaboration with Persia, that suspicion may be justified. But even if they were compelled to stay, they still fought when the moment came. The Helots stayed with their Spartan masters. They had no choice. But some ancient sources suggest that some Helots could have fled and didn't. They chose to die alongside the Spartans. Think about that. Slaves choosing to die with the men who enslaved them, because in that moment they were fighting for something larger than their bondage. So 1,500 to 2,000 men remained at Thermopylae to face the entire Persian army. They knew they would die. There was no dramatic last-minute rescue planned, no hope of reinforcements, just a mathematical certainty. They would be surrounded, outnumbered hundreds to one, and they would be annihilated. But every hour they held the pass was an hour the retreating Greek forces gained. Every Persian they killed was one fewer chasing the retreat. Their death would buy life for others. The morning of the third day began with the Greeks abandoning their defensive wall. This confused the Persians at first. Were they retreating? But then they realized what was happening. The Greeks were advancing. They moved forward into the wider part of the pass, away from the narrow choke point. They were seeking space to fight, room to kill as many Persians as possible before the end came. Leonidas led from the front. This was crucial in ancient warfare. A king who asked his men to die had to be willing to die first. The Spartans formed their phalanx and charged. Not a defensive stand this time, an attack. They hit the Persian lines like a hammer blow. The Persians, expecting the Greeks to be demoralized by their hopeless situation, instead met men fighting with the fury of the doomed. Men with nothing to lose are the most dangerous enemies of all. The fighting was savage beyond description. The Greeks were no longer trying to hold a position, they were trying to kill. The disciplined phalanx gave way to a wild melee as Greek lines penetrated deep into the Persian ranks. Spartans wielded their spears until they shattered, then fought with swords. When swords broke, they used their shields as weapons, bashing and crushing. When shields were destroyed, they fought with their hands. One Spartan, Aristodemus, later said, "We stopped being men that morning. We became something else. Death made us free. Fear was gone. Pain was gone. All that remained was the fight. All that mattered was taking as many of them with us as we could. Leonidas fell early in the battle. Multiple sources confirm he died leading a charge against Xerxes' position, trying to kill the great king himself. 4 times the Greeks rallied around his body, trying to recover it. 4 times the Persians pushed them back. The fighting over Leonidas's corpse was so intense that 2 of Xerxes' brothers died there, Persian princes cut down in the melee. Eventually, the Greeks recovered their king's body and carried it back to their shrinking position. The Persians were suffering horrific casualties. Yes, they had overwhelming numbers, but in the close quarters combat, numbers mattered less than skill and desperation. And the Greeks had both in abundance. But then the immortals emerged from the mountain path behind them. The trap closed. The Greeks pulled back to a small hill, the last defensible position. They formed a tight circle, shields out, spears gone. Most fighting now with just swords or even rocks and bare hands. The Persians surrounded the hill and attacked from all sides. The Greeks fought back to back, a shrinking circle of dying men. When the Thebans saw the situation was hopeless, many of them surrendered. The Persians branded them as slaves. The Spartans and Thespians didn't surrender. They fought until they were literally overwhelmed. When the Greeks ran out of weapons, when they were too wounded to stand, the Persians pulled back and finished them with arrows. They shot volley after volley into the hill until nothing moved. The silence that followed must have been profound. 3 days of screaming and killing, and then just the wind blowing across a field of bodies. The Persians had won, but the victory felt hollow. They had lost thousands of men, possibly tens of thousands, to kill fewer than 2,000 Greeks. The best troops in the Persian army, the immortals, had taken heavy casualties. Xerxes was so angry at the Spartans for what they'd done, so enraged by their defiance, that he ordered Leonidas's body decapitated and crucified. This was deeply dishonorable in both Greek and Persian culture. It showed how much the Spartans had gotten under his skin. But Xerxes had won. The pass was open. The Greek fleet at Artemisium, hearing of the disaster at Thermopylae, withdrew south. The Persians could now march freely into central Greece. Within weeks, they occupied Athens. The city was nearly empty, its population evacuated to the island of Salamis. The Persians burned the city. They destroyed the temples on the Acropolis. They seemed to have won the war. Except they hadn't. Thermopylae changed everything. The battle became a rallying cry. The Greeks who had been wavering, who had been considering surrender, saw that resistance was possible. If 300 Spartans could hold the Persian army for 3 days, if they could inflict such casualties, if they could make Xerxes pay so dearly for a single pass, then maybe the Persians weren't invincible after all. The Greek fleet, reinforced and reorganized, met the Persian navy at Salamis and destroyed it. Without naval superiority, the Persian army couldn't be properly supplied. Xerxes, fearing being trapped in Greece, withdrew back to Asia with much of his army, leaving a large force under General Mardonius to continue the campaign. The following year, at Plataea, a combined Greek army decisively defeated the Persians. Mardonius died in the battle. The Persian invasion was over. But none of that would have been possible without Thermopylae. The 3 days bought at the hot gates gave the Greeks time to evacuate Athens, time to reorganize their fleet, time to prepare their defenses. More importantly, it gave them proof that Persians could bleed. It gave them hope. And hope is the most powerful weapon in any war. The story of Thermopylae spread across Greece and beyond. The poet Simonides wrote an epitaph for the Spartan dead that was inscribed on a stone at the battlefield. "Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie." Simple words, no boasting, no claims of glory, just duty fulfilled. For Spartans, that was enough. But what about the Thespians? 700 men from a small city made the same choice as the Spartans. They stayed, they fought, they died. Yet history barely remembers them. The Spartans had their culture of death before dishonor, their lifetime of training, their reputation as the greatest warriors in Greece. What the Thespians had was just courage. Raw, ordinary, extraordinary courage. That might be even more remarkable. One detail haunts me. After the battle, the Greeks found that the Thespians had fought so fiercely, so completely, that entire family lines had been wiped out. Fathers and sons who had marched to Thermopylae together, brothers who had stood side by side, all gone in a single day. The city of Thespia was left with a hole in its population that never quite healed. But they never regretted sending their men. Years later, when someone asked a Thespian elder if the sacrifice was worth it, he responded, "Worth it? Greece survived. Athens survived. Freedom survived. Yes, it was worth it. It was worth everything." The two Spartans who survived Thermopylae faced vastly different fates. Aristodemus had been sent away before the final battle due to a severe eye infection that left him temporarily blind. When he returned to Sparta, he was branded a coward, the trembler, and lived in disgrace. No one would speak to him. No one would give him fire. No one would let him marry their daughter. A year later, at Plataea, Aristodemus charged alone into the Persian lines, fighting with suicidal fury until he was cut down. He was seeking death, seeking to clear his name. The Spartans acknowledged his bravery at Plataea, but refused to grant him honors, saying he had fought like a madman, seeking death, rather than a disciplined soldier serving Sparta. Even in death, he remained dishonored for surviving Thermopylae. The other survivor, Pantites, had been sent as a messenger to Thessaly and missed the battle. When he returned to Sparta and learned what had happened, he hanged himself. He couldn't live with the shame of surviving when his comrades had died. That was Sparta. Survival wasn't celebrated. Survival was suspicious. Only death in battle truly honored a warrior. The Persians eventually retreated from Greece entirely. The Greeks went back to fighting each other, as they always did. Sparta and Athens would spend the next century in conflict, culminating in the devastating Peloponnesian War that crippled both cities. The unity forged at Thermopylae was temporary, but the memory endured. 200 years after Thermopylae, Alexander the Great would cite the battle as inflation when he invaded Persia. He saw himself as avenging Leonidas, paying back the Persians for burning Athens. The irony is that Alexander was from Macedon, and the Macedonians had sided with Persia during Xerxes' invasion. But myths are flexible. They serve the needs of the present, not the truth of the past. The Romans admired the Spartans and saw Thermopylae as the ultimate example of military virtue. Disciplined soldiers following orders unto death, buying victory for their nation through sacrifice. When Roman legions faced impossible odds, commanders would invoke Leonidas. Stand like Spartans, die like Spartans, make them pay for every inch. In the modern era, Thermopylae has been invoked by everyone from poets to politicians, often stripped of context and deployed as whatever message the speaker wants to send. But the real story doesn't need embellishment. It doesn't need myths. The truth is powerful enough. Think about what happened at that pass. A small force of Greeks, knowing they would die, chose to stand anyway. Not because they were superhuman, not because they were immortal warriors from a comic book, because they were men who understood that some things matter more than survival. They understood that free men have to be willing to die to stay free. They understood that sometimes courage means standing still when every instinct screams at you to run. Were they heroes? Yes, but not in the simple way we often mean that word. They weren't perfect. Sparta was a brutal, militaristic slave state built on the subjugation of the Helot population. The Spartans who died at Thermopylae defending Greek freedom lived in a society that denied freedom to thousands. That's a contradiction we can't ignore. The Helots who died at Thermopylae were fighting to preserve a system that enslaved them. What do we do with that knowledge? Maybe we accept that history is complicated. Maybe we acknowledge that people can do remarkable things for flawed reasons. The Spartans weren't fighting for freedom in the abstract. They were fighting for their freedom, their way of life, their right to govern themselves rather than submit to a foreign emperor. That their way of life included slavery doesn't erase the courage of their stand. It complicates it. It should make us think harder about what we mean by freedom, by heroism, by sacrifice. The Persians too deserve more nuance than they usually get. Xerxes wasn't a cartoon villain. The Persian Empire was in many ways more tolerant and cosmopolitan than the Greek city-states. It allowed subject peoples to keep their religions and customs. It built roads and infrastructure. It created a functioning administrative system that governed millions of people. Yes, it was an autocratic empire, but the Greeks' precious freedom included slavery, the subjugation of women, and constant warfare between cities. The moral landscape of the ancient world doesn't have clear good guys and bad guys. But at Thermopylae, in that specific moment, the sides were clear enough. An enormous empire seeking to expand through conquest met a coalition of states fighting for survival. And a small force of men stood in a narrow pass and said, "No further." For 3 days, they made it stick. The effects rippled through time. The defeat of Xerxes meant Greece remained free to develop its culture, its philosophy, its art, its experiments in democracy. Would Western civilization look different if Persia had conquered Greece? We can't know. History doesn't come with alternate timelines. But we can say this. The men who died at Thermopylae believed they were dying for something that mattered. They believed Greece was worth saving. And in the centuries that followed, Greek ideas about philosophy, mathematics, drama, history, and politics spread throughout the Mediterranean and eventually the world. Maybe they were right. Maybe it was worth it. On the hill where the final stand took place, archaeologists have found thousands of arrowheads. Persian bronze piled in the dirt. Evidence of that final barrage that ended the battle. Standing there today, you can look down at the pass, though the coastline has changed over the millennia and the sea has receded. You can see how narrow it was, how perfect a defensive position. You can imagine the heat, the dust, the screaming. You can imagine what it took to stand there and not break. The memorial at Thermopylae shows Leonidas and his Spartans frozen in marble. Thousands of tourists visit every year. They take pictures. They remember the movie with the six-pack abs and the slow-motion fighting. Most don't think about the Thespians. Most don't think about the Helots. Most don't think about the contradictions and complications. They think about courage. They think about defiance. They think about standing firm against impossible odds. Maybe that's enough. Maybe the myth serves a purpose, even when it simplifies the truth. Because the core truth of Thermopylae isn't complicated. It's the simplest, oldest truth in human warfare. Some people, in some moments, refuse to yield. They plant their feet and they say no. They know they'll lose. They know they'll die. They do it anyway. The pass is quiet now. The battles are long over. But the memory remains. Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, they lie. And the Thespians beside them. And the Helots, who had no choice, but chose to fight anyway. And all the others, whose names we've forgotten, but whose blood bought time for Greece to survive. In the end, Thermopylae wasn't really about 300 Spartans. It was about what happens when ordinary people make extraordinary choices. It was about a moment when the outcome of history hung on the courage of a few thousand men in a narrow pass by the sea. They couldn't see the future. They couldn't know that their stand would echo through 25 centuries. They just knew what they had to do in that moment. And they did it. That's the real story of Thermopylae. Not a myth, not a legend. Just men, fear, blood, dust, heat, pain, death, and a choice made and kept. 3 days that changed the world. 3 days that proved that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's standing firm despite the fear. It's doing what needs to be done when doing it means dying. The hot gates earned their name that summer. In heat and blood and fire, a small force held back an empire. They lost the battle, but in losing, they won something greater. They proved that free men fighting for their homes are worth more than any number of conscripts fighting for a distant king. They proved that spirit matters more than numbers. They proved that sometimes the last stand isn't the end. Sometimes it's just the beginning. The dust has settled. The bones have turned to dust. The Persian Empire fell to Alexander. The Greek city-states tore each other apart. Rome rose and fell. The world changed and changed again. But the story endures. As long as people remember Thermopylae, as long as they tell the tale of the men who stood in the pass, something essential survives. The memory of courage. The promise that tyranny can be resisted. The knowledge that sacrifice for something greater than yourself is the highest calling a person can answer. 3 days in August, 480 BC. A handful of men. A narrow pass. And a choice that echoes across eternity. That was Thermopylae. That was the real story. And it's more powerful than any myth could ever be.